Hey everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to do my August reading wrap-up. But also, I first, of course, have to show you my shirt I'm wearing since it matches the theme of this month. So yes, everything I read this month I got from the library, except one of them that I got as an ARC from NetGalley. I don't know if it's been this self-isolating for the past year and a half, but being in my apartment and just seeing things like my books like so often around me makes me realize just how often they just sit there. So for the past couple of months, I actually got rid of at least like 50 books or so. And I'm really trying to think about what it means to consciously have a book collection. And like I know, and my brain certainly knows, that I'm running out of room there for the amount of books I've read. Since I've read so many, I feel like definitely in my lifetime, just how much I'm really digesting everything I can even remember about all the books I look at in my apartment. But hopefully through the efforts of something like this BookTube channel, it can live as its own sort of legacy of how I can remember everything I've read in a way for complete strangers to watch me or listen to me on the internet. And as far as my reading goes this month, I feel like I did read a lot of books about this general wistfulness, which I don't know why, but the end of summer to early fall transition always makes me like super nostalgic and dreamy. So I think my reading was piloted by a lot of the fact that with these stories, or also the nonfiction, how I felt like it had themes often about this idea of returning, or returning to spaces or places, or even returning to oneself. And as I say that, I actually talked about two books already that I read this month in my previous video about denying the American dream, and that was Infinite Country by Patricia Engel and Oh Beautiful by Jung Yun. Again, two books I found super interesting because of how they talked about the American dream, reinterpreting things like family and individualism and collectivism. And yeah, just with the whole shebang of those themes with those two books, but clearly, as I expressed in my video too, that I much preferred Infinite Country over Oh Beautiful. Infinite Country follows a Colombian American family as they try to adapt or process completely the ability to completely immigrate to the United States from Colombia. And the book heavily has themes involved with immigration and undocumented Americans here in the States. And I thought this book did a great job at mishmashing story and theme, especially with how well paced it was, while also giving just enough oomph for well-developed characters, in my opinion. But it's really the writing that really impressed me, especially with these fleeting moments of emotion. Also never sparing this sense of pause that all the characters feel in some way, where they feel like they can't have deliberate access to things like these fleeting emotional moments because they're always so focused on accomplishing this essence of what I described in a way as an idea of the American dream, with the whole book shrouded in either adapting to life in the States or the process of just trying to even get there. Alternatively, in Oh Beautiful, we follow this Asian American woman as she's moving back to North Dakota, and she was an ex-model now turned writer. And after our main character Eleanor has begun refamiliarizing herself with North Dakota, she's realized how much she's changed too. But unfortunately, the snag is that I feel like this book didn't really ever entirely know what it exactly wanted to talk about fully. Whether about things like Asian American identity, or also in my opinion the biggest struggle being the concepts behind Eleanor trying to talk about first wave white feminism. And to make it more complicated, just this general idea about the myth or the lore of small town America. And I really think these could have been like perfect ingredients with the character of Eleanor, but I just think with Jung Yun's direction, it was unfortunately poorly executed. And it's really strange because with Eleanor, I did appreciate her and I appreciated her confidence, but I feel like with a story that was meant to feel inspiring, unfortunately it felt in ways tone deaf and voiceless. Although surprisingly, again, much like what I mentioned in my previous video about denying the dream with these two books, I really liked my reading experience back to back of these two, but even if it means like in isolation of these books separately, how I felt very different about them. But I think that was really the magic of my reading this month, kind of having those nice little coincidences. Liked the reading journey, just not entirely all of the reading between some parts of both of those books. But if you want to know more, I'll be sure to link that video I did recently down below. With the other fiction book I read this month, I read it for Women in Translation Month, which is an event on BookTube. I know they didn't create it, but I know between Matthew, Jennifer, and Kendra. They always host this event every year where in August you read a woman in translation. And for this month I read Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastasic, which is translated, she translated it herself from the Serbo-Croatian. This novel follows a woman named Sarah as she's living in Ireland with her partner. Sarah receives a phone call from her old friend Layla talking about how Layla's brother went missing years ago and how now finally she knows where he is, so she's asking for Sarah's help. But don't get too comfortable on that premise, because while it certainly sounds like this mystery, I would say the book definitely is not within that genre. Instead, I think the premise of this book nicely pairs with the themes that are really honed in, being things like myth and memory, mainly propelled by not only Sarah's relationship with her old friend Layla, but how Layla represents Sarah's old life in Bosnia that she left behind. And throughout the book, we actually flip-flop. So on one hand, we get some alternating chapters between Sarah and Layla's road trip trying to find Layla's brother, and the other actually Sarah already writing about this experience with Layla and Sarah's road trip, with the impressions of it now being in the past tense, and how all of that sort of combines to Sarah thinking of her friendship with Layla and why it seems so life or death to her. And speaking of Layla, she is like the complete cutout or like manifestation of the archetype of cool and confident girl. But Bastasic really writes Layla in this really seductive and magnetic way that feels really organic, especially with how Sarah herself constantly tries to unravel, even having known Layla for years, what exactly makes Layla so endearing. And for me, this is really where the book truly shines, in which Sarah puts herself in these mental scenarios where she often feels suffocated by her own thoughts, and trying to put the puzzle pieces together to not only Layla herself, but Layla kind of being this symbolic gesture of how Sarah approaches all of her relationships, even with the tiniest ounce of intimacy. Because while the story does put up this front that it feels like whenever you get to the end there'd be some sort of big resolution, the real story, I would say, is really how this premise of the linear plot is actually these constant attempts at, before reaching there, how Sarah is able to really define, I guess, these redefining moments for her and what they mean with the trajectory of her own life. As Sarah realizes when being with Layla, she really dives back into her own memories about why is it that she's so committed to being Layla's friend. Going back into memories about like the teacher they had, or the secrets they have, or losing their virginity together, not to each other, but to these two dumb boys. And now with the immediacy of Layla's brother missing and supposedly he's alive somewhere and found, I think it really bridges the gap for Sarah to having to confront this imaginary intimacy with real-world confrontation, where she really has to explain herself for the connections that often feel one-sided between hers and Layla's friendship. As Layla will often point out that Sarah is the one who's sort of making this fiction of Layla, as Layla resists sort of the imagination that Sarah has upon being bound to Layla and what that means for having relationships at all. Since we realize that Sarah herself is a writer, we understand that she can be good at creating these impressions of possibly maybe being too good at assessing people and kind of making herself think that she's so good at it that it has to be the truest depiction of who these people are. And through Sarah putting these pieces together of trying to really establish what is the realist sense of a person and what is not, I think was the greatest sort of reward for me with this book, because I found it all so hypnotizing, especially with the prose being so endearing in itself beyond these two wonderful characters. For example, with Sarah early in the book having to talk to her partner while they're in Ireland, explaining that she has to go and help out Layla, I think reading that is already like some of the best ways in which I've read fiction about people being together. Like within like 10 pages of what I read there is way better than some of the books I even read this year. As Bastasic's words are full of focus and so lucid and have this bit of unrequitedness to him and this kind of pang of bittersweetness. And this book is technically new, so I believe it came out this year for the States because of its translation. But yeah, it was really good. So I really liked this a lot. And I really hope people pick it up because it's so good. And up next, moving now to the nonfiction that I read this month, I read probably what is the most surprising book I've read all year, and that is Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. My initial interest in Alderton is because I heard she came out with her novel this year, which I think is called Ghosts, which is about online dating and being ghosted, which I will not comment on my personal experience about that. And I haven't read Ghosts, but what I did read recently by Alderton is that she came out with some sort of piece about what it's like to be single and how she felt lonely during the last few months or the past year and a half of the pandemic. And while it was short in length and I found some parts of it to be funny, I do feel like it really made me realize that she has a voice, and I was curious what more of that would be like through her nonfiction first, before I read anything like her novel Ghosts. And with Everything I Know About Love, it's pretty much like I expected, being this extension of that article I read, in which it's about, or really targeted towards, I would say, 20 and 30 somethings that are dealing possibly with their own romantic plights, or at least that's what my initial impression of it was. So in a way, I very much did get what I thought I was going to get with Carrie Bradshaw with her laptop vibes. But then I also got very much Bridget Jones' Diary Before She Meets Mr. Darcy, loneliness, clumsy, messy vibes, slash living in a hyper-realized projection of the romance canon vibes. So put that all together and I feel like that's what you get with Everything I Know About Love, which overall, again, was a pleasant surprise. I think what's great about this memoir is, while of course getting those bits which are the life lesson-y parts about, you know, pull yourself up with romantic failure or whatever, what really sold it for me is Alderton's organic way of writing about this evolution of how much she really values platonic relationships, and she realizes she's trying to base her romantic relationships on how much she values things like her friendships, confusing her quest for romance as possibly with friendship having this very casual and confident sense of a connection. And a romantic lens may possibly be accidentally portrayed as being this very casual one-night stand type of deal. And those are very much the initial impressions of this book, being about these constant sort of rom-com-y, sitcom-y bits of confrontation with interactions with men that just don't work out. And I am all for a rom-com, so in ways I liked those initial essays or sections or chapters, but what really sold it for me is whenever Alderton has to confront, again, those platonic relationships, such as Alderton's friend announcing to Alderton that her and her long-term partner are splitting up, or another example being Alderton's friend unfortunately losing a family member to illness. And now with those examples being presented to the reader, it makes the reader understand how Alderton is trying to mishmash this sense of the romantic and the platonic, building up to this later section that I really liked about how Alderton is meeting this guy for the first time through online spaces, through like dating apps and whatever. And I didn't know Alderton had it in her, but it is surprisingly some really sad and like lonely stuff, as it feels like Alderton is trying to put on this persona initially of being this host in the room, of wanting to make sure everyone feels comfortable and keeping things light and optimistic, which we later might sort of interpret as Alderton kind of just deflecting her general sadness and loneliness. As in a way, it can kind of feel even more desperate as Alderton has these constant recurring moments of romantic failures. It really solidifies, I think, how Alderton tries to bridge this way of thinking, continuously using phrases that sound maybe straight out of a movie, like Alderton maybe using this phrase, the boyfriend experience, which I think is great because even if it's something me as a reader has never heard of before, it feels like it's trying to build that relationship of just how much it feels like she's trying to adapt to understanding romance as like a course or something like that. If she just learns the tricks of the trade enough, then eventually she'll snag a boyfriend. But apparently the boyfriend experience is where you have someone stay over for the night and then they wake up and they either be super weird, the weirdness hopefully making you feel that you give them permission to easily more exit from your life, or the opposite where they choose to stay and stick around in the morning by maybe making you breakfast or whatever and trying to give you a clue that they're ready to try to make this the real deal. But yeah, I think I was really surprised just by how, like, again, the evolution of her approaches to relationships in general, both romantic and platonic, and how ultimately she just wants to find that piece of not romance being the end goal, but again, trying to just find your person and really hoping that, you know, you'll meet someone if you're lucky enough in your life like that. Otherwise, with this book, there are, of course, some parts that I just glossed over. Like, there's sometimes a bunch of listicles sections or whatever, or like ingredient-based recipe, really cheesy stuff, which I don't like. So yeah, you can skip those sections, but everything else, I think there are like true little like magic moments in here. But I was definitely in the mood to read this because, again, with the idea of like late summer, early fall, I was probably thinking I was really in the mood for something like light and breezy. So yeah, I think this was definitely a great book at a great time for me, but also, again, just how much I was pleasantly surprised by it. And last but not least, for my final book that I read for August, it is The Austen Years, a memoir in 5 novels by Rachel Cohen. At the announcement of her father's illness, Cohen began reading Austen pretty obsessively throughout a span of years. With Cohen being familiar with Austen, I believe she says having read pieces of her before, but never quite in this committed way of reading her, like, and often rereading her too, throughout the span of the announcement of her father's illness, as well as the passage of time after his death. And I've been around the block with some Jane Austen nonfiction before, with other writers commenting on like what her books mean and how that affects their personal lives, but I would say between all of those, that this one by Rachel Cohen is definitely the best and my personal favorite, as I think Cohen does a really great job at blending memoir with her own contextualizing of what Jane Austen's books mean to her. For example, with reading Sense and Sensibility and interpreting it as a grief novel, in which the character Marianne at one point does become ill, so Cohen suggests that's Marianne's breaking point of possibly grieving over her father, which he dies at the beginning of the book. Although it's like pretty well known that Jane Austen isn't someone that focuses on, you know, the doom and gloom of things like grief, with her books often being cited as being more humorous and clever and light. Although truthfully, Austen's heroines do often have these associations to death often being a cause for why the story even exists. And so this leaves Cohen really curious, because she explains that she's having this overwhelming feeling of what exactly makes Austen this undeniable writer that has this timeless magnetism that even leaves readers like Virginia Woolf an avid reader of hers. Because it often feels like Jane Austen is this writer that was so dedicated to imitating her own personal life into what inspires her own fictions. And Rachel Cohen, of course, making sure this book was at least a little biography-ish. Make sure to give that context of instances of either briefly summarizing Jane Austen books or just citing things about Jane Austen's personal life, like her relationship with Tom Lefroy and her sister Cassandra, which were all things I already knew about, but I totally understand with why those things have to be there. So if you have been around the block of reading some Jane Austen nonfiction stuff before, it might sound a little repetitive to you, but I think the shining point about all of this is that Cohen, I think, does a great job at seamlessly transitioning between these instances of contextual evidence, but also then magically pulling in her own personal life and how she uses those themes to talk about what's going on in her life. Treating Jane Austen in a way like Cohen's own confidant, of someone she feels like she can go to in these very transitory periods of her life, like losing her father, but also becoming a mother and just her general way of teaching also in academia. But what's also interesting is that Cohen even talks about having this resistance to this idea of memoir. So I think the reason she becomes so fascinated in Austen is because, like I mentioned earlier, with Austen's ability to imitate life through her own personal experience. And of course, with Rachel Cohen not being spared of having a favorite Austen, as many readers do. Cohen's favorite being Persuasion, which is also, I would say, definitely within my top 3. But the charm of it all being about how Cohen, I think, perfectly describes what is it about someone that when they begin reading Austen, why can't they stop at just reading one? And how is it that Austen is able to disguise these domestic antics as these tiny revelations of pulling back the curtain to the very meaningful small, intimate moments of life. There's actually a passage here I want to read that I think does a good job, in which Cohen writes, "I was not reading Jane Austen either to accept or hide from a new life, but because it gave me room for thought. Austen's rooms, like a stage set, are actually mostly empty. She does not describe clothes or carriages, but about how her characters think about their things. In her rooms, as in ours, people live under great pressure. Time beats down upon us. The world is raging, and we have but each of us a tiny sphere of activity. We are subject to constant interruption, and we must nevertheless exert ourselves to make sense and become coherent. One lives with one eye on the laundry and one eye on the reckoning." Ultimately, what this book does, of me having read it, I think is its greatest achievement, and it immediately made me want to go back and reread Jane Austen's works. And the feeling Cohen gets from reading Jane Austen is exactly how I feel reading Jane Austen, which might be dramatic to say, but it's this feeling of endless gratitude in which, because of Austen, I feel like really with me binge reading her works, much like Cohen did similarly in realizing how much she liked her, is that I can't deny that because of Jane Austen is why I probably love reading so much, by being exposed to her work. And the good news is that everyone loves Jane Austen. They just don't know it yet. But when you do have a few Jane Austen books you've read under your belt, be sure to pick up this book, because I think you would really love it. And yeah, I just really loved it, between all the Jane Austen stuff, of course, but also Cohen's sense of even just thinking of this as a standalone memoir, I think was also really good. So yeah, I think with this book, it was actually my favorite reading experience I had this month, even if it wasn't my favorite book I read this month. And yeah, that does it for everything I read in August, which, when I think about it, I think is probably my favorite reading month I've had so far. Although September seems like stiff competition, because I will be reading the new Sally Rooney and also the new Deborah Levy, and I already have a good head start on Punch Me to the Gods by Brian Broom, which I'm only like a few pages into, maybe like 30 or so, but I'm already really liking it, so I'm really optimistic about that one. Of course, that would leave me to say, let me know what you're reading within the next month, and let me know what you've read for August too, and I'd really love to hear your thoughts also on any of these books that I've talked about today too. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.